Our next speaker is Dr. Robert Murphy, and he's going to be lecturing us this afternoon on capital and interest. Dr. Murphy.
Okay, can everybody hear me all right? All right. So thank you everyone for coming, and I apologize that it's unfortunate that I have to be the one following, taking the group photo out there. That's one of the things I like the least about coming down to Auburn. I don't know about you, but I feel like doing the lecture like this to let myself air out. I had actually toyed the idea of giving this lecture as a zombie, in this way, sort of, but to just go capital the whole time, that would be a little bit difficult. Now, a few of you are like, what? I didn't get that joke. You need to look up, Tom Woods has told me that actually some of you still here don't know what we're talking about. If you go to interviewwithazombie.com, Tom Woods is so narcissistic, he bought that URL just to make sure. And again, for those of you, if you have no idea what we're talking about, you need to look that up. A few housekeeping points. This is great having, this is the first time we had this huge lecture hall. I have noticed, though, that if we ever did have an emergency and we needed to all get out that door, it wouldn't happen, like if there's a fire or something. So the reason you're going to know that there's an emergency is if you see me running out this way. I'm going to be the first one out, but it's only because I need to show you the guys the way out. Okay, so I will be the first one out that door. And the last thing I want to mention is I heard a lot of you grumbling out there with saying take the name tags off, and everyone's complaining in the heat and so forth. But that's for your own good. There was this provision. A lot of people don't know about this. I think Drudge ran a report a few weeks ago. There's a provision in the healthcare legislation that says every year now, as a matter of federal law, the Meese Institute needs to send those group photos to the FBI for analysis. So we don't want to do their work for them, so that's why we're telling you take off the name tag. All right, so I am talking about capital and interest theory now from an Austrian perspective. So this is going to dovetail with, it's sort of a nice little bridge between everything you've learned already up till now this week, and then I need to give you this part, and then the banking lecture that I'm going to give you tomorrow morning also. And those are the key points, so that when, I think it's Roger Garrison, right, tells you about the Austrian business cycle theory, you're going to understand the sort of moving parts in there. All right, so again, with all this stuff, if you just hear the lectures of these first 2 days, you're not going to really know the full scope of Austrian economics. You do need to do the reading that goes along with this stuff, but we're just trying to make sure you get the big picture. So, again, in a lecture that's only an hour long, I can't give you the entire sweep of the Austrian view on capital and interest theory, but I will try to at least make sure you get the basics here. So, let me... What is it? Okay, here we go. And I know I was sitting in the back last night. I know people in the back can't see the bottom, so I'll make sure everything gets up at the top here. In fact, I'll just be a paternalist and only allow you to see what I want you to see, one slide at a time. Now, I was going to do a sort of fancy PowerPoint presentation. It was funny last night, as Guido told us at great length how efficient and wonderful Germans were, within about 3 minutes he went on to describe his own PowerPoint presentation as a disaster. And so rather than subject myself to that sort of vulnerability, I'm going to show the American can-do adaptability, and that's why I'm switching to the paper. I think there's analogs to World War II in there, but I'm not a historian. All right, so the standard definition of capital goods, and this isn't an Austrian thing, this is just standard. If you look at a mainstream textbook, it'll say, what are capital goods? And they mean, in contrast to things like consumer goods and also natural resources. So the definition is going to be produced means of production. And let's just parse that for a minute. The means of production part, that's important. Hang on, let me just show you. All right, so breaking that up, so the means of production, they mean in contrast to consumer goods. Okay, so the means of production, the things that are used to make other goods, whereas a consumer good is the last stage in the process. All right, so the means of production, things like tractors and hammers and saws, things like that, that you don't directly value them. It's not like a television set or a ham sandwich. It's something that's used to produce things. That's what they mean by means of production. But it's also got to be produced. And so they mean in contrast to something that's nature-given. All right? So farmland, at least in its virgin state before it's been improved by human beings, that wouldn't be a capital good. That's just a gift of nature, or like an apple tree that's just out in the forest somewhere shooting out apples. That's certainly useful to people. It's a good, but it's not a capital good so long as it hasn't been changed by people in any way. All right, so that's what the definition of capital goods are. Now, this should be a little bit odd to you because in Austrian theory, we don't actually care so much about the past. So if you think about classical price theory that you've already learned about today and then seen in contrast to the modern subjectivist marginal approach to price theory, in addition to all the other problems with classical price theory, one of the reasons that the labor theory of value is problematic from our modern subjectivist viewpoint is that if you're looking at a certain good, you're in the store and you see a TV set, and you say, well, why is the price what it is? And a classical economist who believed in the labor theory of value would have to give you some story saying, oh, because to create that thing, so many labor hours went into the direct construction of it, but then the materials that went into it took so much labor and so forth to bring those materials into existence. And so when you add it all up, there's blah, 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 so many hours of labor that went into that thing, and that's you have to coax people into working. They don't like to work, and so that's why that thing costs what it does. And it sort of makes sense that the person selling that should be able to get a price for it to compensate all the workers that were involved. All right. So in addition to all the other technical problems with that, because there's all sorts of reasons that story wouldn't hold up if we subjected it to a critique, the other problem is just the straightforward fact that when I'm valuing something, I don't care what its life history was. Right? I don't need to know where it came from. All I care about is my wants, the things of my preferences that it will help satisfy, and its relative scarcity and so forth. But that's when I'm evaluating the utility of something, that's what I care about as a consumer. And so that's one of the problems with the labor theory of value, right, is that the object's history really shouldn't be all that relevant to me. So by the same way, if you're looking at this definition of capital goods, you might say, well, wait a minute, why, if I'm defining something in economic categories, why should it matter to me that the thing was produced or not? And so that's technically the way you would address that. Let me move this up for those in the back. Actually a better definition of capital goods that reflects this nuance is that it's reproducible means of production. All right, so it's sort of a minor point, and the only reason I'm stressing it is because I want to make sure you guys get the idea that economic theory is forward-looking, and that's why I'm stressing this little subtlety here. And then to give you a little story, just to make sure you see the distinction in practice. So if we're picturing, I don't know, the Swiss Family Robinson, they're on some island somewhere that's just them, and they're living, and they would have consumption goods like coconuts that they come from a tree, or if they catch fish, they're going to have for dinner that night. Those would be consumption goods. But they'd also have capital goods, like they might take some vines and tie them together and make a net, and that's a capital good, right? Because it's not directly useful unless the kids are playing tag and throwing nets on each other, right? But in terms of the net giving you direct utility, probably not. The reason the net's valuable is because they know, we can go catch more fish with it, and the fish are directly valuable to us as consumer goods. So that's where the utility of the net comes into play, and it's produced. And they might also have spears. Okay, so they might grab sticks off a tree and sharpen them to a point, and then they go around and they hunt whatever animals are on the island, and the spear obviously is valuable, not directly as a consumption good. You don't want to play tag with the spear unless you're really upset at your sister. And they're hunting with this thing, so you can see it's directly valuable, or it's indirectly valuable, right? So that's why it's a capital good, and it's produced, right? So it's a means of production. It helps them to go catch more animals that they're hunting, but they produced it. Now, what if there's some freak lightning storm that hits a tree branch perfectly so that this stick falls to the ground, and it's indistinguishable from the branches that they had normally taken off and taken a rock and a few hours of their labor to sharpen to a point, right? So that if they hold up the two things, and one of them was just a pure gift of nature with the lightning strike, and the other one was the stick that they physically transformed with their labor and using the rock and so forth, and they were interchangeable, meaning that they were both perfectly useful as a hunting tool. Well, in that case, the Austrian would probably say, well, they're both capital goods, even though technically that thing we know historically wasn't produced by a human being. It was a gift from nature. All right, so so these weird little knife edge cases, but I'm just trying to get you to see the distinction there. That's what we mean. So again, it really, when you're using modern economic analysis, especially in the Austrian school, everything is forward-looking. What matters is, what are my supply of goods right now, capital goods and consumption goods, and things that are given as free gifts from nature, and my own labor power, and then what are my preferences, what are my expectations about the future. Strictly speaking, I don't really care how many labor hours went into this thing. If I'm looking at two sticks, it doesn't really matter to me that, I know this was produced by my dad over the course of a week, and this thing we just found lying on the ground. If they're both equally serviceable for my ends, then they should both be classified in the same way. All right, so that's why I'm saying a better definition would be reproducible. All right, now let me take this down one more round here. Part of the problem at Mises University is some of you, this is your first time here. I've been talking to a lot of you, like you saw Ron Paul or something, you come down here, this is the first you've been exposed to Austrian economics. But then others of the people in here are getting PhDs in economics. All right, so it's hard for us to sort of cater to both groups. So what I'm going to do in this lecture, there's one or two places where I'm going to say this is a bit of a technical digression. So this is one of the points. It won't be long. If I lose you here, don't worry. This will just be a little bit of a digression. As far as where does this point come into play? Why do we care? Why do we have this distinction between capital goods and other means of production? It has to do with, if you're familiar with these terms, in the evenly rotating economy, that capital goods earn a gross rent but not a net rent. And only the original factors, which are labor and natural resources, earn net rents in the evenly rotating economy. So let me just spend a minute or two explaining this point for those of you who are somewhat familiar with the Austrian tradition. But again, if I'm losing you on this one point, don't worry about it. The idea is that because capital goods, what's their, by definition, what makes a capital good different from natural resources is that they're reproducible, right? That I just showed you. That's what the better definition is. So why do we care about that in terms of economic theory? So what? It's because if you can make more of it, well, then that's going to have a certain implication when we start looking at price theory and looking at tendencies of how prices move once things settle down into an equilibrium situation. So in particular, the evenly rotating economy, that was Mises' term for a situation where everything just repeats itself, right? There's no more changes introduced in the system. Everyone's preferences stay the same. There's no technological discoveries. Resource supplies stay the same. And so it's just sort of like looking at the long-run, stable condition of a market economy if you abolish all change and just let everybody settle down into that rhythm. All right, so that's what the evenly rotating economy is. And so the important point is capital goods, because they're reproducible, they don't earn any net rent. So if you're somebody in the evenly rotating economy and your business is to make hammers, let's say, and so how do you do it? You go out and you buy lumber and you buy the metal from the person who produces the metal, and you hire some workers and they fashion it and they put the things together and fashion it up and you sell that hammer. The idea is in the long run, the evenly rotating economy, you're not earning any net rents from that business. You're not earning anything above and beyond what you're having to pay to the people who are selling you the wood and the people selling you the metal and what you have to pay to the workers to assemble the thing and so forth. Okay, because the idea is if you were earning above and beyond that, so that you were earning like this extra return, so to speak, just in your capacity as a person producing hammers, well, how could that be sustainable? Because somebody else could just do the same thing because these hammers are reproducible. So that's why the reproducibility is an important issue there. In contrast, if you're Mickey Mantle or something, or some real productive entertainer and in high demand, and even the roadside economy, it still could be the case that you go and do a show, if you're an entertainer, for example, and you charge a bunch of money, and you're earning a lot for your labor, and that's like a net return to you, right? It's not that somebody else can come along and just do the same thing and drive down your return because you have unique talents, right? So that in a sense, there's like this built-in scarcity, if you will, whereas with the capital goods, yeah, there's scarcity, but only to the extent that the stuff going into it, the constituent parts, are themselves scarce. And so the person whose job it is just to go out and get the ingredients, put them together, and then sell the finished capital good isn't going to be drawing a net return from that operation. All right, so that's why the reproducibility is important and why we even care about it in the first place. Okay. Whoops, too much. So now we're back to the basic lecture here. So if you tune me out there, tune me back in. An important Misesian distinction is between capital goods versus just plain old capital. And if you take a mainstream class or you're reading a mainstream textbook, they might use the terms interchangeably, and actually that's where they get into a lot of trouble. So what I mean is mainstream economists will often in the same argument or train of thought, they will flip back and forth. When they say the word capital, on the one hand, they might mean physical things like 18-wheelers and drill presses and microscopes and hammers, or they might mean money. They might mean financial capital. They might talk about people invested more in IBM, and what they mean is that IBM might have issued new bonds and investors or lent them more money, or IBM issued new stock and people bought that. And so they say, more capital was infused into IBM, and they'll go on from there. So they'll use the terms interchangeably. Austrians are pretty careful about keeping those terms distinct. And we'll see as we go through the lecture why that's important, but I just want to draw your attention to that right now. So if we're talking about physical things, usually we'll use the word capital and follow it with goods to make sure you realize we're talking about the actual capital as opposed to financial capital. Oops. All right, so I'll read this because I know in the back it's a bit hard to see. When, in this context, we're not referring to capital goods, the word capital means financial capital, which is the sum of money prices for assets related to an enterprise minus the financial obligations. All right, so let me just give you an example of this to see the distinction. I like to just talk about somebody who owns a laundromat. And there, if you're talking to the person who owns a laundromat, you might say, what types of capital goods are in your operation? And assuming the person was familiar with Austrian economics and understood why you were using such a strange phrase, he'd say, okay, great. I see that thing over there, those big industrial dryers. Well, those are capital goods. You see over there's the big washing machines. Those are capital goods. I had to buy the cash register. That's a capital good. I had to buy the dispenser that has the single-serve units of detergent and dryer sheets and so forth. That's a capital good. That's a machine that's used in my business. So those are all capital goods, right? They're physical things. They're produced means of production. And then if you say, though, okay, well, how much capital is in your business, and especially if you're just, like another business person talking to this guy talking shop, you say, hey, how much capital have you sunk into your business, or how much capital is in your business right now? He's going to think that you mean if you sold off all of your physical assets and then you paid off any creditors you had, those are people who had lent you money to run the business, and any other sorts of, you paid the utility bill and whatever, your taxes that you owed, when all was said and done, how much money would you have left over? And that's what you would mean if you said to the person how much capital is tied up in your business. And so another way of looking at it is the person who owns a laundromat could look at his books at the end of the year and figure out how much did I earn, how much did I take in from customers over and above the money I spent out on expenses and, hiring workers and buying supplies and so forth. And then you might look and say, okay, I earned, $10,000 when all was said and done, and I've got $1 million invested in this operation, so that's a pretty low rate of return. So maybe I should think about getting out of this industry. Okay, so that's the idea. When you're talking about how much capital is involved in something, usually people would mean financial capital, and that's the definition they have in mind. They mean if you sold off all the assets to raise a bunch of money and then paid off all the debts, what do you have left over? All right, so again, we'll see it a little bit here. It's important to keep those things distinct because when it comes to analyzing how economies grow or it comes to government policy, a lot of times mainstream economists will flip back and forth between those two. In one sentence, they'll be talking about physical machinery, and then the next sentence they'll talk about, they'll have in mind financial capital, and they think that they're basically two sides of the same coin, and it's a little more subtle than that. And so that's part of why Austrians have such what they would consider to be an idiosyncratic view on capital and interest theory, is because Austrians are really careful to keep those things distinct. Okay, another sort of tidbit here is that Marx actually, I don't know if he coined the term, but he was the one who certainly used it and popularized it. The reason what we call the free market economy, we call it capitalism. For a lot of us, we're following in Mises' tradition, and Ayn Rand did this too, of what we mean by the term capitalism is the same thing as private property, people voluntarily exchanging things. But Marx used that term as a smear. And just think about the words. So Marx was saying he was for socialism, whereas he's going to say we are for capitalism. And in his mind, he's already won the battle just by setting those terms, because in his mind, socialism is a system where resources are put to use in the interests of or to serve all of society. Right? So it's socialism. It serves its social purposes. It serves society. Whereas what does capitalism do? Oh, well, that's the social system that puts resources to work to serve the narrow interests of just the capitalists. Okay, and so that's why there's actually a movement afoot. Some libertarians actually don't want to use the term capitalism anymore, and that's part of what goes into there, that they don't want to play into the Marxist hand. But anyway, that's sort of an interesting side note, that the term capitalism, when you think about it, it sort of sucks you into, it sets you up to be defending the narrow capitalists as opposed to socialists who are there in favor of society. Who's against society, right? So what Mises pointed out, though, is he said actually, even though Marx intended this as a smear, it's actually sort of wear it with a badge of honor that it's correct in a sense that the primary or the essence of the capitalist system is the accumulation of capital, and that it's really the savers, the people who abstain from present consumption, and they plow their the resources they free up back into their operations, or they lend it to other entrepreneurs who then start their own businesses. That's really how a society improves. That's how the standard of living increases from generation to generation, is through capital accumulation. And that there's a very important sense in which the driving force in a market economy is the group of capitalists who typically overlap with what most people would mean by entrepreneurs. And so Mises actually sort of embraces that term. And as you know, Mises was a fan of championing the capitalist system, and that's what he meant. So of course, it's not that Mises is conceding, yes, the capitalist system enriches the capitalists and everybody else is left out in the cold. On the contrary, if you understand how a market economy works, the riches brought forth by the capitalists who are just pursuing their own interests ends up showering new consumer goods on everybody. So it's mass production for the masses, and that's partly why Mises thought it was a beautiful social system, and that it actually sort of aligned everyone's interests, in contrast to socialism, which actually really did pit one group of people against everybody else. But in any event, that's part of the rhetoric behind it and why Marx thought that was a disparaging term. Let me spend a few minutes talking about the Austrian approach to capital goods and how that leads to rising standards of living, and then the remainder of the lecture I'll come back to this issue of the relation between capital and interest, because that's one of the thorniest problems in economics. I did my dissertation in capital and interest theory. People warned me that it was the black hole of economics. Like that's, people have actually said that in print, that capital interest theory is the black hole of economics. I like to say my dissertation was so obscure that even Austrians were bored by it. And so that, I mean, it is a difficult concept. So let me first do the easy stuff, if you will, talk about capital accumulation. You should all get that. And then, like I said, I'll circle back and talk about capital and interest. It is, I don't mean to, sometimes people say, don't tell the students that something's going to be really hard, because then they'll just shut their minds down. You know, I don't know, I probably shouldn't have said that, but anyway. Okay, so capital accumulation, it goes back to, boehm-bawerk really was the one that fleshed this out. And if you look at my Mises.org archives, I have a few of my earlier articles were on this stuff, and it really, boehm-bawerk's difficult to read, but some of his work on this is really just beautiful in the sense of laying it all out once you get used to his language. And of course, I wasn't reading it in the German; I was reading the translation. But it's a little bit tough to get into his writing style. But once you get into it, it really is impressive, and he explains things at much greater length than you're going to get in more modern treatment, just because they don't spend as much time on it. So let me just give you this example I've given before to make sure you understand the Austrian view towards capital accumulation and how it makes society grow richer. So first of all, let me just make sure you get this more basic point, that if you ask the average person, you say, hey, are we better off now, or are we richer? Do we have a higher standard of living than people in 1810? And they'll say, of course we do. And you say, well, why is that? Probably most people are going to say, oh, it's because of science and technology, right? The people kept coming up with new ways to do stuff, new inventions, and that's why we're so much richer now than we were 200 years ago. And that's partly true, but what the Austrians stress more than most other schools of thought is the role that capital accumulation plays. So the idea is that even if we just stopped inventing new stuff, if technology came to a standstill and an engineer 50 years from now didn't know anything more than engineers today did, and the same thing with physicists and chemists and so forth, that it's still the case that people 50 years from now, at least if we had a free market economy, would be a lot wealthier than we are today. Now, with the Obama administration, they probably will be poorer, but I'm saying if we had a free market administration and so forth, 50 years in the future, those people would still be a lot wealthier, have a higher standard of living than today, even if technology came to a standstill. And the reason is that typically in a market economy, what happens, and I'm just going over stuff that I think Guido talked about in his last talk, out of people's income, so they could consume a certain amount this year, people will set aside some of it, they'll save some of it, and then they'll plow those savings through investments back into productive enterprises, and that's how workers will be more productive in the future. So what's really happening in the big picture is that the economy is capable of producing all sorts of different things. And that's dependent on the technology that we have, so knowing physical relationships, knowing the science behind it, knowing that, oh, if we build a machine like this and we take atoms and do this with them, then we can generate all sorts of electricity and so forth. Yes, I mean, having that technical know-how is important, but you also need to be able to build those machines. And that's not just purely something coming from the mind. So one way to see it is certain regions of the world right now have a lot lower standard of living than we do in the U.S., but it's not just because the people over there are ignorant. It's not that they're unfamiliar with modern engineering techniques. It's that they don't have the capital that we have in so-called Western countries, right? That they don't have the accumulated tools and machinery, so they can't do the same production techniques there as we can do here. As some of you may know, I went to Haiti a few months ago, and I was talking with some of the engineers who had also come from the United States, and I was just asking them, well, how come these buildings are so vulnerable to earthquakes? And they were going through and explaining all the mistakes, or not the mistakes, but the deficiencies, the inadequacies of the Haitian buildings compared to something that was built to code in the United States. And there are all sorts of reasons, and I kept pushing them saying, but is that because they just didn't know about those things, or is it because it would have been too expensive? And the engineers I was talking to, they didn't really quite see what I was getting at, but it turned out it was both things were at work. That, yeah, a lot of the engineers just were not trained as well as if they had gone to school in the United States, but also the guys who were from the United States down there giving instructions and advice, and the people were saying, okay, what do we do so that if we build a house, it's not going to collapse in the next earthquake? The engineers from the U.S., they couldn't just tell them, we'll build it this way and this way and this way, and here's the blueprints, the way they would design a house in the United States that was going to be in some new development somewhere, because it just would have been way too expensive. There's no way they could have done it that way down in Haiti at this point, because they would have said, we can't get our hands on those materials, or are you kidding me? That would make the house cost 10 years worth of the average person's wage. We can't afford to build a house like that. That's crazy. So you see, that's part of what they ran into. So it's not merely an issue of technical know-how. It's having the right equipment, the right supplies of the various ingredients at your disposal. So in terms of looking at humanity as a whole, and why is it that every generation the standard of living tends to go up, yeah, of course there's technical improvements and so forth, but even beyond that, there's also the fact that every generation, the workers have better tools that they're using. And it's not simply because the people who made tools came up with a great idea to make a better tool. It's that there was more savings every year, and that increased the amount of tools available. So I think it's easiest to see that process if you just picture what's called Robinson Crusoe economics. I think you guys have already heard about that. Austrians like to go through basic principles by imagining an isolated person on an island somewhere just to work out the basics before taking that person and putting him in a modern economy that just gets more complicated. So if you picture Robinson Crusoe on his island, and let's say he's got his cottage, and then there's a stream that's 100 yards away. And Crusoe needs to use water every day, and he says, it'd really be nice if I could get the water into my house. So there's many different techniques he could use, and I'll just walk through this example to sort of illustrate the way boehm-bawerk thought about capital accumulation and how someone becomes richer through that. So one way that's a very immediate way is Crusoe just walks down to the stream and uses his bare hands and cups the water and then walks back to his cottage. If he needs to use the water to take a bath or to cook or something, he could just walk back and forth with his cupped hand. But you can imagine it would take a while. It'd be a very, in a sense, inefficient way. But if he really wants to get a pot of water boiling and he's got the fire going, in his stove in the kitchen, probably that's one of the quickest ways to fill that pot up, right? Probably be quicker if he took the pot down to the river, but he's not the brightest guy, let's just say. All right? So let's say he's going to take a bath, okay? And so he's got to fill up the bathtub, and he could just use his hands. Now, if he's got a little bit more time, let's say that he actually knows that, going forward, I want to be able to take a bath once in a while. I mean, he's alone, so maybe he only takes a bath once a month or something, but at some point, even he needs to take a bath. And he say, okay, well, instead of me using my hands all the time, that's really slow. Why don't I'll climb a tree and I'll get one of those coconuts, I'll crack it open, hollow it out, and then I'll use the empty coconut shells, and that will be quicker, right? Then I'll go to the stream back and forth. But when we say it would be quicker, what we mean is once he has the shells in hand, then it would be quicker from that point to take water from the stream and put it into his bathtub. But actually, factoring the time of going and climbing up and getting the coconuts, it might actually, depending on the numbers, you could see how if he just wants to get some water into his cottage within 15 minutes, it actually would be quickest probably for him just to run back and forth with his hands being cupped. Okay, so the idea is boehm-bawerk was saying if you're willing to wait, if you're willing to postpone the achievement of what your ultimate end is, then you can get more of it for a given input of your labor time. Okay, so again, if you're thinking in terms of units, you'd say, all right, I'm Robinson Crusoe and I want to put in 15 minutes of my effort. How many gallons of water can I get into my bathtub just using 15 minutes of my labor? Well, if it's got to be this 15 minutes right now, probably he's just going to run back and forth and then see how much water he can do with his hands. But if he's willing to say, I can wait till tomorrow, and then I just want to look at, on average, how many gallons could I get for every 15 minutes of work I put into it, well, then you see he can spend the first hour, let's say, of his time going and climbing the tree, getting a coconut, smacking it open, and trying to be careful not to crack it so there's a hole or a leak in it, and hollowing it out. And then once he's spent maybe an hour doing that, then the subsequent 15-minute intervals using those shells, he gets a ton of water into his bathtub, right? So if you took the average and said how much total time did he put into it, how many total gallons, and then divided, you could see that the amount of gallons per minute of his labor would be higher, but the timing would be more distant. Okay, so you get the trade-off there. And then if you push it even further, he wants to really just take care of it. He wants to have a really efficient setup. What he could do is if he can wait a year, let's say. He says, a year from now, I'm always going to need water. I really want to be farsighted. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go maybe take a branch down, sort of smooth it out so it's like a nice smooth pole. I'm going to go find a rock that's sort of flat and maybe and then somehow connect it to the pole. And I'm just making stuff up here. If I were ever on a desert island, I would die within 2 weeks. And so he turn it into a shovel, okay? And then he digs a trench from the river to his house, and then he could come up with all sorts of other things to line it so that it's a nice smooth thing, and he could end up diverting part of the stream into his house so the water's just flowing right in. Right now that might take him a year to get that thing all set so he can regulate the flow and so forth. But then once he was done doing that, he could have gallons flowing in every minute. And if you then, at the end of that process, took an inventory and accounting and said, okay, how many total labor minutes did you put into this project, then divided by how many gallons are you getting, you can see how if he's willing to wait 2-3 years, at some point, the amount of gallons per unit of his labor that he put into the project would dwarf what he could do with his bare hands or what he could do getting the coconut. Okay, so that's the Austrian view of capital accumulation. The idea is that we have all these gifts of nature at our disposal, and we've got our labor power, and when we create capital goods, what we're doing really is we're indirectly approaching the final thing. Instead of us using our labor and the gifts of nature to directly go after whatever the final consumer good is, we're going to take a detour. We're going to first use our labor and nature's gifts to make some intermediate product, namely the capital good, the hammer or the 18-wheeler or whatever it is that's not intrinsically useful to us, but then we'll augment our labor in the future when we go to produce the actual finished consumer good. And so there's the benefit, of course, is that you get more consumer goods per unit of input, but the downside is you have to wait longer for it. Right? And so that principle that I told in that sort of silly story, getting the water to the cottage, holds in general according to the Austrians, and that's the trade-off. That when we save and invest, what we're doing is the economy, instead of cranking out TVs and DVDs and steak dinners in the present, sort of reconfigures itself. When people save more and they direct more away from present consumption and into investment, we understand at the individual financial household level what's going on. Okay, that people are deciding to save more, they spend less on a restaurant, they spend less on going out to the movies and so on, so they have more money, they pump it into their bank account, or they save it, they buy bonds from corporations or whatever, and then they're going to have more money in the future because they're earning interest or other types of return on their investments. And so then they can afford to take a cruise 5 years from now if they just keep saving in the meantime. But physically speaking, the way that works out, the way these individual household financial decisions dovetails with what the economy is physically doing, is that when people spend less on restaurants and they spend less on movie theaters and so on, those businesses shrink, right? The restaurant lets go of waiters, they have fewer shifts. The movie theaters don't show as many films, they don't hire as many people, or some area that would have been a movie theater now is going to be something else because they know that the consumer demand's not there. And so real resources, workers and other resources that could have gone into making more restaurant meals and DVDs and things like that instead get redirected, and they go into making things like 18-wheelers and capital goods, hammers and nails and so forth, that then are going to make people more productive in the future. Okay, so that's the connection between all that. And in this talk, I'm not going to get into it. Roger Garrison, I think, will talk about in his talk about what role the interest rate plays in coordinating all that. Okay, so it's not just this jumble and people are just thrown together and they have all these disparate plans, and some people want to save more and then go on a cruise 5 years from now, and other people who are like in medical school right now, they want to borrow a lot right now and they plan on paying it back once they become a surgeon and have a higher salary. The market sort of makes all that stuff mesh, right, where everybody's intertemporal. Intertemporal is just a fancy word meaning across time, where everybody's intertemporal plans mesh with each other so that people's savings decisions over here correspond with people's borrowing decisions over here, and everybody's plans make sense and they're synchronized, and they accord with the physical reality, the amount of actual savings and physical capital goods in the economy. That stuff all is coordinated in the market economy through entrepreneurship, and in particular through the interest rate. All right, so that's what Roger Garrison's going to talk to you about, and then also about how when the government messes with the interest rate, that it screws up that whole process. Okay, but let's return now to this issue of the connection between capital and interest theory, just at a more basic level. Okay, so what is the interest problem? Okay, and I'll read this for those of you in the back. The interest problem, according to boehm-bawerk, is the following. Suppose a capitalist can spend $100,000 on land, labor, and capital goods, and then 1 year later, the finished product can be sold for $110,000. How can this apparent undervaluation of the factors persist? Okay, now this might surprise you, because most people, when they think of interest, they're thinking of it in terms of a money loan, that I'm going to lend you $100,000 today, and then we agree contractually to a 10% rate of interest, and you pay me back $110,000 12 months from now. And that's what most people think of when they think of interest. But the way that boehm-bawerk thought about it, and subsequent Austrians, is they looked at interest, and he called it originary interest, as being earned in the production markets. So that, yeah, contractually, if somebody lends out actual money and then receives money payment in return, that's certainly an example of interest. But they thought that was just one little example of it. They thought, in general, anytime somebody with financial capital, in the beginning, in the present, can put it to work, so to speak, and then earn back not only the principal but also money on top of that, financial capital on top of that was an interest return. And so the question is, why is that possible? That if you're thinking about it in terms of the production markets, the idea is, and this may be something that some of you had never even realized before, but just think it through for a minute. If it is possible that I can have $100,000 in cash, let's say, and lend it out to somebody at 10% interest, and they pay me back 10% next year, well, then it also has to be the case that if I'm going to invest in some production process, if I'm going to buy raw materials, if I'm going to rent the use of equipment, if I'm going to hire workers to come process these raw materials and work on them and create something that I'm going to sell in the future, well, I also have to earn an interest return on that, because it would be, if I just got back from my customer the money that I had pumped in originally, why would I do that? I could have just lent it out in a contractual loan. Okay, so the interest return that most of you would know as being just existing on the loan market, that also has to permeate all the production markets too. All right, people would refer to as the time value of money. That when an accountant is looking at a firm's books, they need to take into account the fact that the resources they're hiring now are in present dollars, the prices are in present dollars, and when they sell the finished product in the future, the revenues they get at that time are future dollars, and that they're going to have to discount them, and they discount it according to the interest rate. Okay, so for boehm-bawerk, any economist who looks at a market economy sees this happening as just a general rule. Yeah, it's true, some businesses occasionally lose money, like they don't even, not only do they not get back what they put in, but they actually get back less, so they're actually suffering monetary losses. But as a general rule, businesses tend to earn more in revenues then they paid out explicitly to all the ingredients. And so boehm-bawerk thought, well, that's sort of odd when you think about it. Why is it the case that that this is possible? So let me just give you an example. So the idea is, on August 1st, 2010, if some housing developer spends $100,000 on land, labor, and capital goods, and then 1 year later, and so for the whole course of the year, he's buying lumber, he's buying glass, buying material for the roof and so forth, and he has workers come in, skilled workers that are carpenters and so forth, building the house and putting the glass in and everything. And then when all is said and done, he's got this house that's ready 12 months from now, and then he sells it for $110,000. And so that presents, at least on the surface, a bit of a puzzle, because you would think in a competitive market, how can this last? Why wouldn't competition drive up the prices of the inputs and or drive down the price of the finished product until there was equality? Why should that permanent gap of $10,000 exist there? And the idea is, suppose you just you looked at the housing market year in, year out, and that seemed to be this general rule that the housing developer typically, it's with our recent boom and bust in the housing market, this example might seem a bit odd to you, but in general, before all that, it was a case you built a house and you're a developer and you could sell it for more than you actually had to pay out of pocket to construct the thing. And so the problem is, why is that the case? Because normally, as economists, we would say competition would tend to weed that sort of thing out. If we saw that one store is selling Coke for a certain amount per bottle, and then across the street, another store is selling it for $2 more, you would think, if it's the same product, something that can't last. That's something, consumers are going to go to this place, this guy's going to raise his prices, and this guy's going to have to cut his prices. That they can't have this discrepancy last. So the same thing here, what's going on? Boehm-bawerk was saying that is, for him, the interest problem. Okay, now let me try to be crystal clear here. The naive productivity theory is wrong. All right, I'm telling you this because when you see how boehm-bawerk knocks it down, it illustrates his own solution. All right, and I don't know what else I was trying to think I actually was going to omit this, but there's no way I can tell you the Austrian approach to capital and interest without bringing this up. But in previous Mises universities, we've actually had semifinalists in the oral exams come in and they get nervous and they give me the naive productivity theory. And that's just like, no, you're not getting the big check, right? So remember that this is wrong, okay? So I'm telling you this to knock it down, to show you how boehm-bawerk blew up this theory so you can understand the Austrian approach to capital interest and why the Austrian approach is different from the mainstream theory. Okay, so what is the naive productivity theory? How does the naive productivity theorist explain that puzzle we just talked about? They're going to say the return to capital, which is interest or originary interest in boehm-bawerk's terminology, is due to the fact that, hey, capital is productive. And you see here, I was talking about earlier, this flipping back and forth between talking about financial capital versus physical capital goods. And so they're going to say, hey, you can certainly build a bigger or better house by using hammers and saws and pre-cut 2x4s and whatever than if you just started from scratch. And so they think boehm-bawerk's crazy. Of course, somebody who goes and buys a bunch of lumber that's already been prefabricated and who hires a guy who brings in like an electric saw that's real heavy duty and so forth. Obviously, using those capital goods in your operation is going to make you more productive. You can build a bigger house, a nicer house, and so forth. So obviously, when all is said and done, when you go and sell the product, you're going to end up with money in your pocket, more money than you started out with. What's the mystery? You start out with $100,000, you end up with $110,000. It's because capital is productive, duh. And so boehm-bawerk said, no, that's not right. Because go back to the problem. So yeah, capital is productive, but I'm not trying to explain why am I willing to pay money for land, labor, and capital goods. The question isn't, gee, when someone's building a house, why is he willing to hire an expert carpenter to come on board? Why is he willing to go to Home Depot and buy a power drill. That's not the mystery. We know why, because you can assemble the house much more quickly or build a bigger house using power tools than if you used regular tools, or let alone if you used your bare hands. That's not the mystery. The mystery, according to boehm-bawerk, is why do you spend less on these things than you know you're going to be able to sell the house for a year later? Right? So again, the naive productivity theory tries to explain the interest return. And let me just say it in different words to make sure you're getting this essential point. What is the interest return here? It's the $10,000. The capitalist who plows $100,000 into making this house ends up with $110,000. So in a sense, he earned 10% on his money, if you want to think of it like that. So that's what boehm-bawerk's trying to explain. He's trying to explain that $10,000 gap. And so it's no solution, boehm-bawerk pointed out, to tell me, oh, the reason I'm able to turn my $100,000 into $110,000 is because saws are productive. I can cut more wood with a saw than without. That doesn't make any sense. That's true. I can cut more wood with saws than without, but that doesn't explain why when I go to Home Depot and pay for a saw, the amount they're charging me doesn't fully eat away, the $10,000 surplus that I'm going to make. If these ingredients are so useful and productive, how come other entrepreneurs don't see how productive the saw is in the pre-cut 2x4s, and why don't they go to Home Depot and try to buy the saw themselves to bid up its price, so that when all is said and done, it costs $110,000 to build a house that you know you're going to be able to sell for $110,000. Okay, so everyone see that it's true that physical capital goods are physically productive. You can produce more stuff with them than without, but that productivity by itself doesn't explain interest. Okay, because the interest problem is this gap. The interest problem is, why is it that the money you spend on inputs, typically the sum total of that is less than what you think you're going to sell the product for? That's what the interest problem is. And to tell me the ingredients are productive, not only does that not solve the problem, but that almost just sort of underscores what the puzzle is. That's the whole point. How come I'm not paying so much for these productive inputs that the thing they're going to end up producing, its price, just makes me break even? That's the puzzle. Okay, so again, let me just say one more time, the reason people earn interest is not because capital is productive, according to the Austrians. All right, so in the oral exam, don't tell us that. That's going to hurt you. Okay, so getting close on time here. Let me hurry up and give you the answer. Okay, so what is boehm-bawerk's solution then? And in his book, he just goes through and he blows up every explanation of why that interest return exists that you can imagine. He's got literally a whole book that just critiques everybody else's writings up to that point. So in terms of history of economic thought, it's just a tour de force where he classifies everything. If you go to my Mises.org archives, and I have a few in there, I think I talk about 3 different ones. So the naive productivity is one explanation, and then the other one, there's like the Marxist theory, and then there's I think the abstinence theory is another one, where boehm-bawerk goes, comes up with some other economist's explanation for this, and then blows it up. And it's interesting because you learn a lot of economic theory along the way. So that's why I talk about them in the Mises.org archives if you're curious. Okay, but, sir, boehm-bawerk blows up everybody else. So what is the answer then? Oh, again, if I might get personal with him. The answer is present goods are preferred to future goods of comparable quality. All right? Or we could just summarize it by saying people have time preference, is how modern Austrians would explain that. So the idea is, other things equal, I would want to get consumption goods today rather than a year from now. They give me more utility to have them delivered today than if you're merely delivering to me a promise that I'm going to get these things in the future. All right? Now, I'm not going to have time to get into why that's the case, but I just want you to see right now, suppose that is true, that typically, as a general rule, people enjoy getting consumption goods sooner rather than later. If you buy that, well, then the interest problem disappears. We've solved the problem. All right, so that's what I just want to spell out in the last 5 minutes. Okay, so first of all, let's think of something simple. let's switch, this hard intertemporal context. Let's think about something normal, like hamburgers versus steak. So that says, subjectivist price theory says that a pound of steak has a higher price than a pound of hamburger because consumers think steak has a higher marginal utility. So again, if we're economists and we're in the grocery store and we see that steak has a higher price per pound than hamburger, and somebody says, why is that the case? The very first thing we say is, because steak has a higher marginal utility. Right? The consumers value a pound of steak more than a pound of hamburger, and that's why. And if someone says, okay, but why is that the case, you could go ahead and start giving them a lengthy explanation. But first and foremost, how do you explain prices in the market? It's based on consumers' marginal utility, right? So by the same token then, what we're really trying to explain, boehm-bawerk realized, when it comes to interest, is that why is it that a present house is more valuable than a future house? Right? So if people get more utility from a house now than a house available next year, then the market price of a house now is going to be higher. Right? Just like steak right now is more valuable per pound than hamburger right now per pound. Why? Because it's got more marginal utility. Nobody has a problem with that. Okay, well, what if I just approach somebody and I say, do you want a house right now, this brand new house over here, or what if I gave you this airtight claim to be able to move into this house starting in 12 months from now? Typically, most people, especially people who are trying to buy a house, would want the one right now. Right? It's better to have a house right now than to have to wait 12 months to get into a house. All right? So if that seems plausible to you, well, then you understand, okay, that means the price of a house right now is higher than an IOU. Can you guys in the back see the IOU? You have to nod your head one way or the other. Okay. Right now, as August 1st, 2010, somebody says, hey, I'll give you this finished house. How much would you pay me for it? Or I'll give you a claim, this IOU that says one house to be delivered on August 1st, 2011. Because people get more utility from the actual house available right now than they do from just an IOU, promising a house in the future, the market price for the now house, the present house, is going to be higher than the market price of the IOU. In the same way that the market price of a pound of steak is higher than a pound of hamburger. Okay, so that's it right there. And if you get that point, then that earlier paradox falls away. That there isn't actually an undervaluation going on. When somebody right here, when the entrepreneur on August 1st, 2010 is buying the factors to build that house, what he's building right there, what he's buying the factors for, is a future house. Right? Those hiring workers, buying lumber, going to Home Depot and getting the saw, those are ingredients that don't allow him to make a house. More specifically, they allow him to make a house available on August 1st, 2011. And we just saw on the previous piece of paper that right now the market value of a house not available for 12 months is only $100,000. So that's why he only has to pay $100,000 for those inputs. So there isn't any gap there. There's no mystery going on. Competition does drive up the price of those inputs to be equal to their expected market price. But at this point in time, when you're actually buying those resources, that house is a future house that's only worth $100,000. And then when time passes, and that house, in a sense, ripens into a present house, well, then it's worth $110,000. But again, it's not because of the productivity of those ingredients. It's because of the difference between a house being available 12 months from now versus being available right now. And we've seen that somebody would pay $110,000 for that house now, but only $100,000 if it's a prospective good. Okay, so that's why this entrepreneur, this capitalist, is able to earn $10,000 on his investment. It's not because of the productivity of the capital goods. Their productivity is crucial to the story because he can't make a house unless those things are productive. That's why he's paying up to $100,000 for those inputs. But the point is that $10,000 gain comes from the passage of time. It comes from the fact that me just show you one last thing, and then I'll end on that. Look at this. Suppose the person wasn't even interested in the mechanics behind it, and someone just had $100,000, and he went up to someone, and he actually just bought that piece of paper, that legally binding claim, that IOU, for a house. He could also make $10,000. Right now, on August 1st, 2010, he goes in the market and buys the IOU for $100,000. He waits 12 months, and then he turns in the IOU and gets the house delivered to him, because that's what the IOU says. You get a house on 8/1/2011, and then he sells the house for $110,000. And so he turned his $100,000 into $110,000. So clearly there was nothing about productivity going on there. The reason he earned his money was because of the gap in valuation between the present good versus the future good. So that is the Austrian view to interest, that interest fundamentally is due to future goods turning into present goods. So when you invest right now, in a sense, you're buying technological claims on future consumer goods that have a lower value because they're in the future, and you discount them. But then as time passes and they turn into present goods that you then sell to consumers, you're getting more from consumers than you had to pay for the inputs because of that time differential. Right? And so that's the Austrian explanation. That's why Austrians think interest is fundamentally about time preference, not about capital productivity. And that's a huge difference between the Austrians and mainstream economists. Okay, thanks everyone.